Chapter 50. After loading my things and saying goodbye to Mr. Wellington, we followed the river south on a 2-lane highway, leaving behind the limestone hills and cedar groves of Sumter County. We moved through a land of hard, dusty clay and broom sedge and pines that I'd never seen. Uncle Mike's truck was worn and comfortable, and he sat back and drove with his wrist flopped over the top of the steering wheel like nothing worried him. The cool air swept across our faces, and I sensed I was being drawn to a place that I'd been stolen from so long ago. Well, I realized I read this, but whatever. I guess you're my pap now, he smiled. I like for you to think of me that way. Well, then I'd like to ask you some things. Go ahead, he said. What about Mr. Wellington and Hal? Will I get to see them again? Sure, I'll drive you up sometime if you want. It only takes about 4 hours, and you can always write letters. I'm good at writing letters. Mr. Wellington said he was going to come and check on me in a couple of weeks. He said he'd try to bring your rifle when he came. It made me feel better to think that I'd see Mr. Wellington again in so short a time. And I watched out the window and saw a school and students standing out front waiting to be picked up. Station wagons and parents and buses clustered and moved about. A boy was taking a flag down from a flagpole. I turned to Uncle Mike. Do you remember me? We all remember you when you were little. Your daddy and mama didn't disappear until about a year after you were born. Well, why didn't you come looking for us? As a matter of fact, I did. At first, we were worried that something had happened to you all, and it didn't take us long to find out that Oliver had shut down his bank accounts in Birmingham and sold his house and his car. He didn't leave a note or anything. I drove up several times after that and asked around about you. You never had grandparents on your mother's side, so there wasn't anyone to talk to there. Why didn't he want you to come find us? Uncle Mike was quiet for a few seconds, and then finally he looked over at me. No one really knows why he did what he did. I can tell you that I remember him as a boy, no different from any other boy. He was my best friend growing up. Some people change when they get older. Sometimes things happen that can make them change a lot. In your father's case, he saw something in Vietnam that caused him to lose trust in everybody around him. But you were his best friend. He saw a lot of his friends die over there. Maybe he didn't want any more friends. My friend died too, I said. Mr. Wellington told me about Kit. I'm sorry that happened. I looked out the window again. Moon? Yes, sir. The important thing is that you don't have to feel the way your father did. Most people don't. I leaned my head against the door and slept with the wind licking through my bangs. I woke when Uncle Mike pulled the truck over at a Spur gas station. He smiled at me in the rearview mirror as the pump numbers clicked over. Afterwards, he strolled inside and I watched him pay through the store glass. He came out with 2 bags of potato chips and threw one into my window as he passed. Back on the road, Uncle Mike dialed the radio to a country station and played it low. I sat with my back against the door frame and ate my potato chips, and I watched his face while he chewed. He looked at me once and then smiled and then stared ahead at the blacktop. You like him? Yes, sir. After a second, I turned and sank into the seat and watched the countryside. We were passing fields of rich black dirt, plowed up nearly to the road. The pine trees were taller and greener and stood in the yards of white farmhouses. The land was mostly flat and the air was thick and humid like nothing I'd ever felt. Uncle Mike? Yeah? Thanks for coming to get me. I'm glad I got a place to go. I don't want to be locked up anymore. In fact, I'm done being alone. He put his hand on my head and then brushed my hair back, and I had a warm feeling pass through me. Chapter 51. How much further? I asked. Oh, about a mile. I sat up in my seat and stared ahead. The sun was setting outside my window, and the smell of soybeans and corn was strong in the cool dusk. We had skirted the outside of the city and were moving into the countryside again. To the east, I could see the tall buildings of downtown Mobile standing against the horizon. How much further now? Uncle Mike pointed ahead of us. That house up there. And the first thing I noticed about Uncle Mike's house was that it was a 1-story brick home backed up by a pecan orchard. I like pecan trees. Yeah, well, we've got a bunch. They had put up a small banner on the fence that read, Welcome home, Moon. And I knew my family. Oh, and my new family came out of the house and stood in the yard as we drove up. I felt my hands growing fidgety, and I looked at Uncle Mike. What do I do? He laughed. You'll be okay. Just get out of the truck and meet everybody. I felt my face burning red as Uncle Sarah knelt down and hugged me. My new brother David was only a year older than me, and my new sister Alice was a year younger. They said hello, and I nodded at them while my face was pressed into Aunt Sarah's bosom. She finally pushed me back from the shoulder and stared at me. He looks just like his mother. They say he doesn't eat like her, though, Uncle Mike said. Aunt Sarah stood and sniffed and wiped her eyes. We'll just have to see about that, she said. Are you hungry, Moon? Yes, ma'am. I can't imagine all you've been through. I'm going to have to feed you 4 times a day to get you some meat on your bones. I feel pretty good now, but I like to eat 4 times a day. She laughed and turned around. My lord, she said, let's all go inside. David and Alice crowded beside me while we walked. David kept glancing over at me. I heard you beat up on some grown men, I finally said. Yeah, well, I had to whip up on a couple. People were chasing me all over. They said you had your own rifle. I nodded. Me and Pap both. I've got some climbing spikes Daddy gave me. Climbing spikes? Yeah, you can strap them to your legs and climb a tree straight as a pole. Man, I want to see those. What else have you got? Uncle Mike laughed and then put his hands on my back. You two will have time for all of that later. Let's go inside and get Moon cleaned up and fed. The house had 3 bedrooms. Uncle Mike and Aunt Sarah slept in one, and Alice had another. I was to share the last room with David. My bed hadn't arrived yet, and Uncle Sarah assured me that it would look just like David's. She showed me the place where my bed would go and a closet where I would put my things. I don't have much, I told her, just some old traps and some clothes I made. I got Pap's personal box. We'll take care of all of it, honey, she said. You'll just have the same things that every other boy has. I looked at David and he smiled and nodded like they'd been talking about it. We seated ourselves around the dinner table, and Aunt Sarah served pork roast and cream spinach and buttered sourdough bread. It was better than any food I'd had in the forest or in jail or at Pinson or even at Hal's. At first, nobody said much, and I could feel them watching me. I was uncomfortable at the table and did my best to hold my silverware the right way. And eventually, Uncle Mike reached over and took my bread and pinched my pork with it and held it out to me like a sandwich. I set my fork and knife down and smiled and took it from him. Everybody began to laugh, and before long, we were all eating our pork in a sandwich. So, show us something, Moon, Uncle Mike said. Well, like what? Can you make an animal sound? David said. Well, what do you want to hear? Your best one. Well, it's a loud one, I warned them. Do it anyway. Aunt Sarah set her glass down. I don't know if... It's okay, Sarah, Uncle Mike said. I set the sandwich down and got out of my chair. I bent over so that my head rested on my knees and sucked in my breath and twisted my face the right way, and I made the sound of a bobcat scream. Row! And when I looked up, everybody was staring at me with wide eyes. After a second, Uncle Mike began to clap. Aunt Sarah scooted her chair back and wiped the corners of her mouth with the napkin. My lord, she said. That's a bobcat. It's supposed to sound like a screaming woman, I told her. A wolf, David yelled. Aunt Sarah shifted in her chair and straightened her back. Now, I don't know about a wolf. Me neither, I said. There's no wolves in Alabama. I know a coyote, though. Well, a coyote then, said Alice. I looked up at the ceiling, pursed my lips, and began barking like a coyote. Yip, 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 yip. And when I looked down, David was sitting on top of his chair and leaning back towards me. What else? He stammered. A deer? David and Alice nodded, and I tossed my head from side to side and snorted like a flagged deer. That's enough for now, Aunt Sarah said. Moon, you're very talented. They're going to love you at school, David said. I smiled and got back into my chair. Do you think so? Yeah. Nobody can do all of those sounds. After we finished our meal, I told them about living in the forest. I described how Pap and I had built the shelter and the types of books that we studied. They wanted to know about the strangest things that we'd eaten. And I told them about armadillo stew and snake rolls. I told them about the time that it rained really hard and a rattlesnake family tried to move into the shelter with us. They listened to me late into the night until Alice fell asleep against Uncle Mike's shoulder. I think it's time for all of us to go to bed, he said. It's been a big day. After saying goodnight to David and Alice, Aunt Sarah got a blanket from the closet and spread it over the sofa for me. When she was done, she put her hand on my back and asked if I was okay sleeping in the living room my first night with them. It's better than pine straw and ticks, I said. I like it just fine. She smiled and yawned. I'm glad you're so easy to please, Moon. Good night, you two. Good night, I said. I lay on the sofa and pulled the blanket up to my chin. Uncle Mike sat across from me in a chair. You still okay? He finally said. I nodded. I know you've been through some tough times, and I don't expect you to just slide into things around here. There's a lot to get used to. I'm feeling better already. It takes time to start a new life, especially when you've come from a background as different as yours. I felt the soft pillow under my head and listened to the ticking of the mantel clock. I like everything about this place. Uncle Mike smiled. His eyes told me that what I needed to know about the type of father that he was going to be. They were Pap's own eyes, but there was something more gentle and calm about them. I could tell that he wanted to say something that would make me feel better about all that I'd been through in the last few months, but he didn't need to say anything. I'm going to be just fine, I told him. You don't need to worry about me. The end. What'd you guys think?